Have you ever prepared something with all your love, and in the end, felt like no one cared? That night, while the world celebrated Christmas with hugs, laughter, and roaring fireplaces, I stood there, in silence, listening only to the ticking of the clock. The table was set with all the details my mother taught me when I was a girl. A white tablecloth embroidered with a small blue flower, the cutlery that only comes out of the drawer on special occasions, and the glass platter holding the same roasted turkey that had delighted 3 generations of our family. Everything was ready. Everything except them. I spent the week preparing that meal with my heart full of anticipation. I washed, chopped, and seasoned each dish like someone sewing a souvenir. I bought soda, panettone, even those Christmas cookies my grandson loves. I imagined every hug, every laugh, every story told around the table. I imagined it, because everything remained just imagination. When the clock struck midnight, my phone vibrated. I felt a sense of relief, thinking they were just around the corner. But it was just a message. This year we've decided to celebrate with young people, Mom. Don't be upset. That was it. A curt, quick text, like someone canceling a coffee date. There, sitting at the head of the table with my apron still around my waist, I stared at my empty plate, and for a moment, I felt invisible. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt your chest tighten as if you'd swallowed your own silence? Have you ever prepared everything with hope, only to receive abandonment as a response? At that moment, I realized that the true cold of Christmas didn't come from outside. It lived within me. I, who had spent my entire life prioritizing family, found myself like a forgotten piece of furniture in a corner of the house. The grandmother who was only remembered when she needed to care for someone, pay someone, or be silent. The woman who made the layette, who taught how to tie shoelaces, who took care of the fever while the parents were away. And now I was just a name in the family group, ignored when I most needed to be remembered. But you know, there's a kind of grief that doesn't break. It molds. I didn't cry out loud. I didn't slam the door. I just stood up. I looked around, saw the dinner party untouched, the glow of the lights flickering on no one, and something inside me shifted. It was as if the sadness had ignited a spark. It wasn't anger. It was dignity. And that's when I decided to do something that even I didn't expect. Because that supper, that silence, and that "don't be upset" were just the beginning. My name is Helen. I'm 74 years old. And even though time has taken many things from me, including my mother, what I've never lost is the value of being together, especially at Christmas. Ever since I can remember, I've learned that a plentiful table isn't just about food, it's about presence, respect, and the affectionate glances we exchange as we break bread. And even when money was tight, when the month was barely over, I found a way. I sold cakes, ironed clothes, and skipped buying myself something, all to ensure that night, the family not only had something to eat but also a place to feel loved. It wasn't about luxury. It was about care. About details. Clean tablecloths, sparkling glasses, that little background tune playing on my mother's old radio, which I still remember. And maybe that's why, when life decided to test me with silence that Christmas, it hurt so much. Because I always believed that if I took care of everyone else, I would naturally be taken care of too. But the hidden truth no one tells us is that unmeasured self-giving often becomes invisibility. I spent decades believing that presence was repaid with gratitude, that sacrifice was repaid with love. And yet, there I was, in an empty room, with cutlery no one would use and food no one would taste. And it wasn't the absence that hurt the most. It was the memory of everything I'd done, of everything I'd sacrificed myself for, of all the times I'd said, "Okay, I'll take the smaller cut," thinking the return would come later. But sometimes it doesn't. When I say this, I don't speak with bitterness. I speak clearly. I speak with the lucidity that only solitude teaches. That moment made me reconsider my own journey. How many times have I kept quiet to keep the peace? How many times have I accepted less than I deserved in the name of family? How many times have I masked frustration with a smile, with a "don't worry, everything's fine"? These are small decisions that, added together, slowly erase us. And that's how I began to realize something I'd never noticed before. My name was only mentioned when someone needed me. When a babysitter was missing, when the bank denied a loan, when pain knocked on another door. I was the one who solved the problem, who endured. But who cares when we're broken inside? That night, the silence of the house gave me more answers than any conversation. I didn't need to hear excuses or justifications. All I had to do was look at the set table, my grandson's empty chair, the spot where my son-in-law used to make jokes, and understand that maybe I was just a forgotten detail in their routine. Not out of malice, but out of distraction. Because of the modern illusion that time with young people is more valuable than time with those who've lived twice as long. The supper I prepared was much more than a meal. It was my gesture of love. It was my attempt to keep alive a tradition that no longer fit into their world. And when I realized this, I felt something inside me needed to change. I no longer wanted to fuel a dynamic in which my efforts were invisible. I no longer wanted to be just a backdrop to other people's happiness. I needed to transform that pain into something bigger, something that would have an impact, something that wouldn't just get me out of that place, but that would leave a trail of meaning wherever it went. Because if Christmas was about presents, then I needed to be present for someone who would truly feel my presence. And it was with this thought that, even with my heart still heavy, I went to my room, changed my clothes, folded my apron, and looked at myself in the mirror honestly. That woman there had so much history, so much love, so much dignity. And perhaps it was time to show it to the world. But in a way no one expected. Deep down, I already knew something had changed. And it wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, like paint fading over time, like the smell of coffee fading when no one else sits at the table. It started with the delays. Before, everyone would arrive early, clapping at the gate, laughing loudly in the hallway. Then, messages warning them they'd be late became routine. "We're leaving now, Grandma," they'd say at 8 o'clock. But they only appeared when the rice had gone cold. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I also kept quiet. Because there's a kind of silence we choose so as not to spoil what little remains. So I pretended not to understand. I served the dishes with the same smile as always, as if everything was the same. As if that slight delay weren't a sign of a greater, deeper, more painful disconnect. And yet it was. Soon after, the different dishes arrived. The food I prepared with such care began to be seen as outdated. "Oh, Grandma, we brought a brie and apricot quiche because we're avoiding fried foods." And I, who had spent the whole morning preparing the coccinelle and codfish balls, smiled sheepishly, as if accepting being left out without quite understanding why. I put my treats in the fridge and pretended I didn't care. Because, deep down, I just wanted them there. But that constant quest to please, to keep tradition alive, left me in an uncomfortable place. As if I were trying to fit in at a party that wasn't mine anymore. As if my time had passed and I was now just a background character in their lives. And that's when we start to wonder, where did I get lost? The conversations changed, too. Before, they'd ask me everything, from how to wash woolen clothes to how to care for a baby with a cold. Now, they'd only half listen, their eyes glued to their phones. "Yes, Grandma, I know," they'd say before I'd even finished. As if I were always late to their new reality. As if my voice had grown old, too. It's strange to realize you've been replaced by a more practical routine, a faster life. Strange to feel like your name only appears when someone needs a favor. I've become the grandmother who serves, who cares, who lends, but who is no longer heard. I've become that presence expected to always be there, but who isn't celebrated when she is. And that's where the most silent pain lies. That of being forgotten while being present. That of being in the same room and not being seen. The hidden truth behind these holiday parties is that many of us older women aren't part of the celebration. We're part of the invisible labor that sustains it all. Is the tablecloth ironed? She did it. Is the food hot? She did it. But who gets the hug, the Instagram photo, the lively toast? It's never her. Over time, I began to understand that it wasn't just a change in behavior. It was a change in mindset. They were looking ahead, while I was still holding on tight to my roots. And perhaps that's why they no longer saw what I did as important. As if tradition were a burden. As if simple love weren't enough. I still told myself that Christmas is a time for togetherness. I repeated it like a mantra, like someone trying to convince themselves that the effort is still worth it. But with each passing year, I felt more alone at that table laden with food and empty of affection. Even the smell of dinner seemed less intense. As if even the food had realized no one else was coming. Even so, I kept going. I kept going out of stubbornness, out of hope, perhaps out of fear of facing the truth. Because accepting that you're no longer a part of the lives of those you raised is one of the hardest wounds to heal. It's the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but gnaws at you. It slowly darkens your soul. That Christmas, when everything finally fell apart, I was no longer the same Helen who waited at the gate with her eyes shining. I was a different person. A version of me that began to awaken in that instant when I understood, with all the impact possible, that I could no longer insist on keeping alive a connection that only I nurtured. And when that becomes clear, something inside us begins to move. This time, it was different. And maybe that's why it hurt so much more. Because they didn't just promise they'd come, they insisted. They made a point of giving me that false reassurance that, for a moment, made me believe everything would go back to the way it was before. "Of course we'll go, Mom. It'll be beautiful as always," my daughter said over the phone, her sweet voice reminding me of the times when she still needed me to pick out her dinner shoes. That sentence, spoken with such certainty, had the power to rekindle something inside me that had been extinguished for some time. I believed. I believed like someone who still has faith that things can work out. Like someone who still carries in their heart the childlike hope that family, despite its setbacks, always finds its way back. And it was with this feeling that I entered the kitchen and started all over again. I washed the dishes, decorated the house, bought fresh fruit, hazelnuts, raisins, and everything that reminded me of my childhood dinner. I even made David's favorite dessert, that lemon trifle with champagne wafers that he always scrapes to the bottom of the dish. During the days leading up to Christmas, I found myself smiling to myself as I arranged the red napkins. I ironed the tablecloth, filled the fruit bowl with polished apples, and lit cinnamon-scented candles. I wanted everything to be perfect. Because when you're always waiting for someone to notice you, you turn the little details into grand declarations of love. But the hidden truth about empty promises is that they hurt more than silence. Because they create an illusion. And it was this illusion that I clung to. An illusion that made me get up earlier to put the ham in the oven and pushed me to decorate the tree alone, believing that year, everything would taste like reunion. I believed so much that I even dressed up more than usual. I put on perfume. I pinned an antique brooch on my dress, an inheritance from my mother, as if she could also be with me in some way. As the clock ticked, I sat and rose from my living room chair. With every noise at the gate, my heart raced. With every car that passed on the street, I straightened up like someone expecting an important visitor. And time passed. Minutes turned into hours. The oven turned off by itself. The dessert began to sweat. And I remained there, sitting, alone, waiting. It wasn't until after midnight that my phone vibrated. I opened it with a glimmer of hope, like someone opening an old letter hoping for good news. But it was just a short message. "Mom, this year we decided to celebrate only among young people, okay? Don't be sad." I reread it 2-3 times. As if I hadn't quite understood. As if those words couldn't possibly be speaking to me. But they were. And they were the ones that tore apart what little hope I had left. In that moment, what hurt wasn't the absence. It was the neglect disguised as modernity. It was the contempt packaged in banal justifications. As if my time had expired. As if the love I'd given for so many years could be exchanged for a cold message on my cell phone. They knew what Christmas meant to me. They knew what cooking that meal meant. They knew that the table setting was my attempt to keep the family together, even if only for a few hours. And yet, they chose not to come. The pain of that moment was dry. No scandal. No screaming. It was a different kind of silence. A kind of silence that echoes inside and seems to speak to all the memories you've held dear throughout your life. And there, alone in that room full of ornaments, I found myself confronted with a profound revelation. It wasn't the first time they'd left me out. But it was the first time I was willing to see it clearly. It hit me in a cruel and liberating way. That promise hadn't just broken my Christmas. It had broken the spell. It showed me how much I'd been trying to keep a flame burning that no longer warmed anyone but myself. And as I looked at the table, the plates untouched and the smell of food still in the air, I felt my journey was about to change direction. Because there are moments that allow no return. Moments that demand decisions. And although my heart was broken, something inside me, perhaps a forgotten piece of my dignity, began to slowly rise up. As if to say, Helen, you still exist. And you deserve more than this. At midnight, I opened the window. Not on impulse, but on a glimmer of hope. I genuinely thought for a second that it might be some surprise, some unexpected delay, perhaps a gate suddenly opening with laughter and gift bags. I had this naive fantasy that everyone was out there, waiting for the right moment to move me. A part of me still believed that love could arrive at the last minute and change everything. But it didn't. There was only the sound of the empty street, the sharp wind blowing against the curtains, and the constant twinkling of the Christmas lights, which now seemed to mock my naivete. I closed the window slowly, like someone accepting a bitter truth for the first time. I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. A deep silence filled the room, but it wasn't the kind that soothes. It was the kind that weighs heavily, that echoes inside. It was the sound of humiliation, of knowing you were intentionally forgotten, that there was no unforeseen event, no accident, no miscommunication. It was a choice. Cold, direct, and cruel. I sat on the edge of my chair, my hands on the tablecloth, trying to understand how I'd gotten there. Because it's one thing to grieve unexpected abandonment. It's quite another to grieve the abandonment that was foreseen, announced, and yet ignored. And in that moment, I cried. Not loudly, not outrageously. I cried in the way that only those who have had their hearts emptied understand. Silently, with tears in my eyes and my entire body paralyzed. It was as if everything I'd done up until that point, all the dinners, all the sleepless nights, all the words swallowed in the name of peace, had been for nothing. I felt like I'd been reduced to a decorative role. A living reminder of the past they no longer wanted to keep around. And the worst part of it all was that, in that moment, I felt ashamed. Ashamed of having believed. Ashamed of having deceived myself. Ashamed of having poured so much love into a table no one wanted to sit at. And it made me think of how many women, how many grandmothers, how many mothers go through this every year. Disguising their pain, hiding their tears, preparing the feast of loneliness with a forced smile on their face. How many stay there, holding back so as not to worry anyone, pretending everything is fine while falling apart inside. How many, like me, received a promise as a gift and, instead of a hug, received the weight of indifference. That wasn't just a one-night stand. It was a turning point. A revelation that tore my old mindset apart. For the first time in a long time, I saw my life from the outside. As if I were peering behind the scenes of my own story and realizing I'd been accepting crumbs disguised as affection. And it wasn't because I was weak or stupid. It was because I loved. And because I loved too much, I let other people's love diminish my worth. But true love doesn't dismiss, doesn't ignore, doesn't remain silent. True love doesn't appear only when convenient. And there, in the center of that beautiful room, full of food and completely empty of people, I understood that I could no longer continue in the same way. That something inside me had changed. That my journey could no longer be guided by the decisions of others. I felt a mixture of pain and awakening. A kind of emotional shock that reorganized everything inside. It was as if I'd spent my entire life memorizing a play for an audience that was no longer in the audience. And in that moment, I realized I no longer needed to repeat that old script, That role of grandmother who accepts everything, who annuls herself in the name of a tradition that is no longer mine. I needed to do something. Not for revenge, not for attention, but to remind myself who I was, and who I could still be. Because even though that night had started with tears, something inside me was shifting. A spark. A desire to transform it all into something bigger, stronger, more real. Something that made sense, even if it didn't make sense to them. And that's when, without thinking much, I got up from my chair, went to the kitchen, picked up one of the serving dishes with still shaking hands. That night was hard to pass. I slept badly, if I can even say I slept at all. Actually, I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't stop. Every thought was a scene repeating itself, a memory distorted by pain, an unanswered question. I wondered how we get to this point, of being forgotten by the one we loved most. But deep down, I knew that the wound wasn't born that night. It was only revealed there. It was as if everything I'd hidden for years had come to the surface with the force of a silent flood. And it's precisely in this kind of silence that some decisions are formed. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. The house was cold, but not as cold as I felt inside. Dinner was still on the table, as if time had frozen everything there. The tablecloth now had grease stains, the silverware still lined up, the candles half burnt. It was the exact image of the previous night, something beautiful gone half finished. And then came the decision. It wasn't an impulse. It was clarity, an internal transformation, a movement from the inside out that said, this isn't going to end like this. That food, which had been prepared with so much love, didn't deserve to be thrown away. And neither did I. There was something bigger in this situation, and I needed to find it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was about to do something that wasn't just to please others. It was to remind myself of my worth. I went to the kitchen and grabbed all the lunchboxes I'd been saving for years, just in case. And well, I finally did. I began distributing the portions carefully, like someone packing up pieces of their own history. I put in rice, farofa, meat, dessert. I didn't let anything go uneaten. Because, even if they were for strangers, I wanted them to feel the flavor of what I'd put there. Respect, dedication, dignity. I dressed simply, but I fixed my hair and put on a nice coat. I didn't want to look defeated. It wasn't an act of charity. It was an act of identity. I left with my lunches in cloth bags, walking slowly through the still empty streets of the day after Christmas. And I confess, for a moment, I wondered if it made any sense. But I continued. That's when I found the first man, sitting on the sidewalk with a thin blanket draped over his legs. His eyes were deep set but kind. I approached and simply asked, "Would you like some Christmas dinner?" He looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He accepted. He smiled with an expression of surprise and gratitude that made me crumble inside. I felt a lump in my throat. A lump of relief. From then on, everything became bigger. Each person who received a meal carried a piece of my pain, but also a bit of my strength. I saw mothers with children, elderly people in silence, men alone with weary looks. None of them asked why. None of them complained. They just accepted. And it had such a profound impact on me that, somehow, I began to feel part of something again. Each delivery was a way to reclaim what my family had taken from me. The feeling of being useful, of being seen, of being remembered for something beyond the role of grandmother who serves. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my presence was making a difference. And not because I was part of an imposed tradition, but because I chose to be there, in that moment, that way. And as the morning wore on, I realized I was no longer the same Helen from the night before. Something had shifted inside me. A silent key that took me out of the place of waiting and brought me to the center of a new journey. And even if it was discreet, without an audience, without Instagram photos, it was a journey with purpose. With truth. With real impact. Back home, the bags were empty, but my heart, was filled with a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness, nor revenge. It was awareness. It was as if I had finally seen behind the scenes of my own story. And there, sitting again in my living room, my hands warmed by freshly brewed coffee, I understood that Christmas that year hadn't been a failure. It had been a rebirth. A silent but definitive turning point. Because it was in that simple gesture, almost invisible to the eyes of the world, that I found a new way of existing. And something told me that that wouldn't be the last time I would surprise. And so it was that, without grand speeches or elaborate plans, I found a new kind of Christmas. One that didn't depend on the presence of others, but on my own decision to be present, body, soul, and heart, for what truly made sense. Sitting there, with the warm cup in my hands and the faint scent of coffee filling the room, I thought about how many other women might be experiencing something similar. In silence. In secret. Swallowing the pain with dignity, as I myself had so often done. If at any point in this story you felt something similar, if this experience reminded you of someone, of a situation that left a mark on you, or of a wound you still carry quietly inside, let me know in the comments. Sometimes, all we need is to know we're not alone. And by sharing, you can not only ease your own heart, but also touch the hearts of others who may be reading and feeling the same way but don't have the courage to say it. That's why this channel exists. To tell stories that don't fit into Christmas commercials. Real stories, full of pain, new beginnings, and truths that most people prefer to hide. When you comment, like, and subscribe, it's not just a technical gesture. It's like saying, this story matters. And, believe me, it makes all the difference. It gives us the strength to continue bringing you stories like this. Stories that move, provoke, and make us think about what truly matters in life. So, if anything in this story revolted you, moved you, or reminded you of someone special, leave your comment below. Click the like button, because it helps this message reach those who need it most. And if you want to continue hearing stories that truly touch you, subscribe to the channel. There's still much to be said. There's much hidden truth that deserves to be revealed. And sometimes, it all starts with a simple meal, rejected by some, but warming the souls of many. The streets were still damp from the early morning hours when I began delivering the first lunches. Each step I took with those bags was a kind of liberation. At first, I confess, there was a certain trepidation. A mixture of shame and doubt, as if a part of me was still waiting for someone from my family to show up. Tell me it had all been a misunderstanding, that the delay was just a distraction, that Christmas could still be saved. But no one showed up. And for once, that didn't paralyze me. The first man I handed one of the lunch boxes to looked at me suspiciously. He was sitting on the sidewalk, covered with a piece of black plastic. His eyes searched for explanations even before I said anything. As I approached, I whispered, "It's Christmas food, made with love." He took it as if holding something sacred. 7 years, he said, his voice breaking. It's been 7 years since I've had turkey at Christmas. That pierced me. Not like a new pain, but like a revelation. The truth I needed to hear was there, in that man invisible to the world, reminding me that my meal wasn't rejected. It was simply going where it was truly needed. I continued walking, meeting people who seemed to have emerged from the same oblivion I'd been in until the night before. Elderly people with vacant looks, women with children in their arms, young people lost in their own exhaustion. Each lunchbox delivered was more than food. It was presence. It was a sign that someone had thought of them, even if only for a few minutes. In every look of gratitude, in every shy hug, I found a piece of the woman I was trying to reclaim within myself. And that's when I understood. The turning point wasn't what I did with the supper. It was what the supper did to me. That morning no longer felt like December 26th. It felt like a different kind of celebration. There were no fairy lights, no Christmas carols. There was only humanity. A kind of humanity we only find when we strip away the decorations and face the harsh truth of life. The truth that there are many people in the world who would trade any gift for a hot meal, a sincere gesture, a little dignity. And there I was, with my hands still scarred from the previous Christmas's cooking. I felt more useful than I had at any other Christmas in my life. It's curious how pain, when embraced, transforms. It doesn't just disappear, it changes form. It becomes purpose. And that day, delivering food door to door, I realized that the idea of being disposable, because I've aged, of being a burden, because I have time on my hands, was simply a reflection of a society that easily forgets its roots. And if there's one thing I learned that morning, it was that our value doesn't diminish with time. It just becomes harder to see for those who are too distracted. Every person who looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you," was, unknowingly, stitching together the pieces of my heart. And they weren't empty thanks. They were wet eyes, hands that trembled as they received their lunch, people who expected nothing from anyone. It was then that I truly felt the impact of what I was doing. And I'm not talking about doing good to feel better. It was something more than that. It was about giving humanity back to the world, starting with my own. I returned home with less weight on my shoulders. The bags were empty, but I felt as if I'd received something in return. Not a gift, nor recognition, but a kind of clarity, like someone seeing for the first time after a long time in the dark. I sat in the living room chair, looked at the still-lit Christmas tree, and felt no sadness. I felt respect. For myself. For the woman who, even forgotten by those who should remember her, had the courage to transform abandonment into a gesture, humiliation into surrender, loneliness into connection. That dinner that would have been thrown away fed people who had nowhere to fall. And more than that, it nourished me from within. It made me understand that, despite everything, I could still be a beacon. I could still make an impact. I could still choose not to hide behind the pain. And that, for me, was the greatest miracle of that Christmas. I can't explain exactly what changed, but something changed. Maybe it was my mindset. Maybe it was the way I looked at the world after that morning. What I do know is that I was no longer the woman who sat alone at midnight. I had stepped off the stage, yes, but to create a new stage. A stage where my story would still make sense. Where I wouldn't be just a supporting character in someone else's story, but the author of my own journey. And it was at that exact moment, sitting there, breathing deeply, that something even more unexpected happened. I was still sitting in the armchair, my heart warmed by that rare feeling of having done the right thing, when I heard the notification sound on my phone. I didn't pay much attention at first. I thought it was some end-of-year promotion, one of those automatic messages that arrive when we least expect it. But then another one came. And another. And another. I went to the coffee table, picked up the phone, and, out of curiosity, unlocked the screen. What I saw there paralyzed me. My name was in several messages. People I'd never met, from places I didn't even know recognized my face. Some sent kind words, others said they'd cried watching the video. It took me a few seconds to understand. Then a younger neighbor, whom I barely knew, sent me a link. It was a recording. A young woman, the kind who always carries her cell phone in her hand, had filmed me delivering the lunchboxes. The title was simple, Grandma's Dinner That Moved the Whole Street. And there, in that video, I appeared smiling, with trembling hands and shining eyes, handing the food to that man on the sidewalk. The video had thousands of views. Emotional comments, supportive messages, people sharing with captions like, "This destroyed me inside. Everyone should see this. The true magic of Christmas is here." I read each comment as if listening to voices that finally see you. It was as if, suddenly, my story had emerged from anonymity and resonated with a multitude of people who also carried similar wounds. The curious thing is that I didn't feel vanity. It wasn't about fame. It was about impact. About realizing that, even unintentionally, I had touched people with a simple, real gesture, charged with feeling. And at that moment, something my mother said when I was a girl came to mind. Those who sow with truth, reap with dignity. I think that was it. My gesture was born of pain, but it wasn't a cry for help. It was a decision. And without realizing it, it became a mirror in which many people saw themselves. And then came the most unexpected part. My family saw it. I saw that my daughter liked the video. Then I received a message from her. A like. It just said, "I saw the video. We need to talk." I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen for a while, trying to decipher the tone of those words. There was no excuse, no justification, just an attempt to reconnect after the damage. My heart pounded, not out of anger, but because of everything that came to light in that moment. The behind the scenes of so many Christmases where I pretended everything was fine. The times I kept quiet so as not to hurt others' pride. All of this pulsed inside me as if begging for a new way to be heard. I also saw that my grandson had shared the video on his own profile. "My grandmother is bigger than all this," he wrote. A simple phrase, but one that carried a kind of recognition I'd never heard directly. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing me for who I truly am. Not just as the woman who prepares dinner, but as someone with a voice, with pain, with choice. It's strange how recognition, when it comes in public, touches us more deeply than when it comes at home. Perhaps because it comes not with the weight of obligation, but with the freedom of someone who has been truly touched. It was as if the world had stopped for a few seconds to listen to a story that, for years, had been whispered between platters and tablecloths. I received calls from strangers, invitations for interviews, and even an NGO contacted me saying they wanted to help continue the initiative in other neighborhoods. That moved me, of course, but it also gave me a new clarity. That video wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a silent transformation, which began inside my home, at an empty table, and was now spreading through other homes, other tables, other hearts. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. Because sometimes, when we least expect it, life forces us to face head-on what we most avoid. And that's exactly what happened the next morning. The next morning arrived with the sun streaming through the crack in the curtains, unbidden, as if trying to illuminate a part of my story that was still hazy. I felt a certain weight in the air, a mix of anticipation and calm. The kind of feeling that comes when you know something important is about to happen, but have no idea what comes next. My phone vibrated again. It was my daughter. This time, not a text message. She was outside. I opened the door with the expression of someone who's seen too much to be surprised. She stood there, alone, with teary eyes and a changed expression, as if she'd finally grasped the gravity of what she'd done. He didn't say good morning, didn't even try to smile. He simply entered, silently, and stood, looking around the room as if it were the first time he'd seen the space. Maybe it was. Because there are things we only see after we've lost them. She sat up slowly, ran her hands over her knees, and finally spoke. "We were in a rush, Mom. We didn't think we'd hurt you." It was a short, dry sentence. And at the same time, it carried a confession. They hadn't thought of me. I listened to it all without interrupting, like someone reading a belated letter. I looked into her eyes for a few seconds before responding. "Don't worry. God gave me a much bigger dinner than you planned." My voice was calm, without rancor. It wasn't an attack. It was an acknowledgement. A truth that had formed within me and no longer depended on her acceptance. It was as if that sentence closed a silent cycle within our relationship. Because, for the first time, I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't asking to be seen, nor was I begging for affection. I was simply being who I was, a woman who chose not to be a prisoner of contempt. She was silent for a few seconds. And in that silence, I realized there was no more room for excuses. Everything that needed to be said was already there, hovering between us. She knew it. And so did I. The difference was that now I was no longer playing the role of the woman who accepts everything in the name of harmony. I was the woman who, with a platter of food and a silent decision, had shown that dignity isn't something you ask for, it's something you earn. It was in that moment that something changed between us. Not because she apologized, she didn't. But because she saw. For the first time, my daughter truly saw me. As a human being. As a woman. As someone who feels, who hopes, who gets frustrated, but who chooses not to destroy herself because of it. And this new perspective she gave me was the beginning of a new way of existing between us. She stood up shortly afterward, saying she had to go but wanted to talk more. I just nodded. I calmly closed the door, took a deep breath, and leaned my back against the wall. My body trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from liberation. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it made it clear that my worth no longer depended on their recognition. And that was the biggest transformation of my journey. Realizing this changes everything. Because the hidden truth behind many family relationships is that they're sustained by the expectation that the other person will, one day, reciprocate everything we've done. And when that doesn't happen, the pain is immense. But there is a turning point. That moment when we stop waiting and start living from our own conscience. And that's exactly where I was now. I returned to the kitchen, put on some tea, and sat by the window. The street was quiet, the wind swaying the trees in the garden. The peace I felt in that moment wasn't an absence of conflict, it was true presence. For the first time in a long time, I knew who I was, what I had done, and why it mattered. Because sometimes we spend so much time trying to be enough for others that we forget to be fair to our own story. And that day, with a lighter heart and less tearful eyes, I understood that I had taken a step of no return. A step toward myself. And although there was still much to face, something inside me already knew that the worst was over. Or at least it was about to be. Today, as Christmas approaches, my house is no longer silent. But not because my family has returned. They have indeed reappeared little by little, yes, with more frequent messages, a few short visits, looks still laden with disguised guilt. But the real change happened inside, within me. That emptiness I felt in the chairs at the table wasn't just a physical absence. It was a lack of meaning, of purpose, of belonging. And that's what I've rebuilt with my own hands. After that dinner that made headlines, they started reaching out to me. People from churches, neighbors, young volunteers, even strangers called me and said, "I want to help." And I, who thought I'd been discarded, realized I still had a lot to offer. Not with grand speeches, nor with moral lessons, but with presence, with affection, with that simple touch that only those who have been invisible know the value of. I organized everything little by little. I used my kitchen, my recipes, my life experience, but, above all, my pain. Because it was pain that taught me the value of sharing. I began preparing communal meals with the same love as always, but now with a new purpose. And do you know what happened? The table was never empty again. People came. From all over. Some brought food, others helped set up, serve, clean up. And many, many indeed, came just to sit and eat. It wasn't just food they received. It was welcome. It was eye contact. It was listening without rushing. I created a space there where no one needed to justify their loneliness. Where everyone had a place. Where no one was forgotten because they were old, poor, strange, or different. And the most beautiful thing is that when you truly do something, without expecting anything in return, life responds. Silently, but it does respond. Every dish served at that table is a reminder of this. Because the transformation I experienced wasn't just mine. Every Christmas, I see other stories healing there. A woman who lost her husband and had no one to spend the night with. A young man fresh off the streets, trying to start over. A child who had never seen a Christmas tree set up with such care. The hidden truth behind our celebrations is that, often, the brightness of the lights serves to hide sadness. But there, at the communal meal, there is no disguise. There is truth. There is surrender. There are tears and there is laughter. There are stories being rewritten with simplicity and affection. And that, for me, is the true meaning of Christmas. It is where pain finds purpose. Where absence becomes presence. Where what is left for some becomes salvation for others. If you've ever felt empty on special occasions, if you've waited for someone who never arrived, if you've held back your tears to avoid ruining someone else's party, know that you're not alone. There are people in the world who need exactly what you thought was no longer useful. That food that was going to waste. That time you think no one appreciates. That hug you keep, too embarrassed to offer. All of this has value. It has an impact. And sometimes, that's what sparks hope in others. The journey that began on a night of abandonment took me to places I never imagined. I met incredible people. I revisited my own story with new eyes. I learned that silence also speaks, and often screams. But that, with courage and a simple gesture, we can change everything. You don't need a stage. You don't need an audience. You just need truth. And if today I can say that my table is full, it's not because the dishes are expensive or because the chairs are all occupied by people from the same family. It's because each place there holds a story, a life, a chance to start over. And that, for me, is the greatest gift life could give me. That's why, every time someone asks me if I regret having made that meal, I smile. Because it was precisely in that moment of greatest loneliness that I discovered the depth of my strength. And with each new Christmas, when the lights come on and the scents fill the house, I remember, the love denied to me that night was the same love that overflowed for so many. And my story, well, it's still being written. Because as long as there's someone hungry for affection, for listening, for respect, there will be a place at my table. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this story found a place within you. And that, for me, makes it all worthwhile. Because what we experience, feel, and share on this channel isn't just entertainment. It's real life. It's about stories that touch, awaken, and often heal ancient silences that no one sees. If you felt this connection, if a phrase made you reflect or remember something you experienced, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. This space is made for people like us. Those who feel deeply, who live intensely, and who need, every now and then, to hear that they are not alone. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me," just so I know you were with me until the end. I read each one with an open heart, and your presence here makes all the difference for me and for other people who are just arriving. Oh, and if this story really touched you, click the like button. It's a small gesture, but it helps this content reach even more people who may need to hear exactly this today. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. The story doesn't end here. It just changes scenery.